Welcome to an exploration of one of the most dominant middle game strategies, which involves complete deprivation of the opponent's counterplay. To demonstrate this strategy, we'll analyze Vasily Smyslov's positional masterpiece, where he completely paralyzed his opponent by means of monumental blockade over the entire board. By doing so, he ensured his opponent's pieces remained passive and ineffective throughout the game, whereas Smyslov's pieces dominated the whole board. This domination let Smyslov sacrifice material and finish the game with a spectacular checkmate. Smyslov's opponent, Svetozar Gligoric, starts with d4 and Smyslov plays the Grünfeld defense, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3 and d5. Gligoric opts for the exchange variation, c takes d, knight takes d5, e4 attacking the knight, black must exchange the knights, and after b takes c, white has built a monumental pawn center. On the other hand, this center will become a target of attack. First, Smyslov plays bishop g7, putting pressure on the d4 pawn. After white develops his light-squared bishop, he plays c5, attacking the pawn one more time and threatening to capture on d4, winning a pawn. So white must defend his pawn. In case white defends the pawn in the most natural way by developing the knight on the most active square, knight f3, in this case after castling, black can play bishop g4 next move, pinning the important knight, which is one of the main defenders of the d4 pawn, after which white might have difficulties in holding this pawn. For this reason, instead of knight f3, Gligoric makes a stronger move, knight e2. Now, of course, bishop g4 wouldn't make much sense, because white would simply play f3, retaining his knight, which is defending the pawn, and kicking out the bishop from g4. For this reason, after knight e2, Smyslov simply castles. Gligoric does the same, and Smyslov develops his queen's knight, attacking the d4 pawn one more time and again threatening to capture on d4 and win a pawn. That's why Gligoric develops his bishop and defends the pawn. And Smyslov plays queen c7. The idea is to vacate the d8 square for the rook, from which the rook will put pressure on the d4 pawn, and also create an unpleasant x-ray on the d file, as the white queen is also placed on this file. Besides that, the black queen is also x-raying the unguarded c4 bishop, so black might also think about capturing on d4 in order to open the c file, and after white recaptures, the black knight might jump. For example, it might capture on d4 with the discovered attack of the black queen on the white bishop. For this reason, white plays rook c1, indirectly defending the bishop. Now, in case black exchanges on d4 after c takes d, the c file would open, but it would be in white's favor, because the bishop would be defended by the rook, and this time white would create an unpleasant x-ray on the c file, and the black queen might become a target of attack. For this reason, of course, Smyslov doesn't exchange on d4. He plays, in accordance with his plan, rook d8, putting more pressure on the d4 pawn. Now, the most natural plan for white would be f4, of course. His bishop is already attacking the king side, the weakened f7 pawn, so by playing f4 followed by f5, white can think about opening the f file for his rook, after which the black king might be in trouble. But in case white plays f4 right away, bishop g4 might be unpleasant. So pawns don't move backwards, the pawn cannot return to f3, and by playing bishop g4, black would again pin this important knight, which is the main defender of the d4 pawn, and again it would be difficult for white to hold this important pawn. For this reason, before pushing the f pawn to f4, Gligoric makes a prophylactic move, h3, taking under control this square and preventing bishop g4, and he's going to play f4 next move. So black has put a lot of pressure on the d4 pawn, but white has defended this pawn. Now Smyslov puts pressure on the second central pawn, on the e4 pawn. He plays b6, preparing the fianchetto of the light-squared bishop, and from b7 this bishop will attack the e4 pawn. Gligoric plays, in accordance with his plan, f4. Now, in case Smyslov plays bishop b7 right away, of course, f5 would follow and black might get in trouble. For this reason, before playing bishop b7, Smyslov also makes a prophylactic move, e6, taking under control the f5 square and preventing white from playing f5, and he will play bishop b7 next move. Gligoric moves his queen away from this file, from the d file, from the unpleasant x-ray, to e1. It might seem that as the white queen has stopped defending the d4 pawn, black might capture on d4, winning a pawn, but it isn't the case. In case black captures on d4, it might seem that black wins a pawn, but after mass exchanges on d4, it turns out that white has a strong move, bishop d5, with the discovered attack on the black queen and also attack on the rook. Black is losing material in this case. For this reason, after queen e1, of course, Smyslov didn't capture on d4. Instead, he plays bishop b7. And now it seems that he is threatening to win a pawn by capturing on d4, because after all these mass exchanges on d4, after black wins a pawn, white wouldn't have the bishop d5 move anymore, which would have attacked, which would be meant to attack this rook, because the bishop on b7, of course, would prevent it. So, as the d4 pawn is under attack, Gligoric plays queen f2, reinforcing the d4 pawn. However, it might be better to play f5 right away, because it was Gligoric's last chance, last opportunity to play f5. And after possible f5, a very sharp tactical battle might have begun. But instead of this, Gligoric plays queen f2, which makes sense. So first he reinforces the d4 pawn, doubles his major pieces on the f file, and he's ready to push the f pawn forward with very unpleasant pressure on the f file. However, it isn't gonna happen, because Smyslov will prevent it. First he plays knight a5, attacking the bishop and also opening the light-squared bishop's diagonal, attacking the e4 pawn. So in order to save material, the only move is bishop d3, and now that the bishop is kicked out of this diagonal and it isn't attacking the e6 pawn anymore, and as white is ready to push the f pawn forward, Smyslov prevents it by playing f5 himself. Also attacking the e4 pawn for the second time, and inducing his opponent to push the pawn forward, which Gligoric does. So Smyslov has blockaded the king side, but in order to completely deprive his opponent of any possible counter chances on all parts of the board, Smyslov blockades the queen side too. He plays c4 with the tempo, attacking the bishop, and after the bishop retreats, we can see Smyslov's idea. So the king side is blockaded, the f pawn and e5 pawn are blockaded. That means white doesn't have any active play on the king side anymore. The center is also blockaded, the d4 pawn cannot move forward as the d5 square is completely controlled by black, and the queen side is also blockaded. And these pawns, these four pawns, completely restrict white pieces. The bishop is bad, it's restricted by f4, d4 and c3 pawns. The knight cannot jump to any of these squares, so it's a very passive piece too. The light-squared bishop is also bad, as it's restricted by black f5 pawn. The rooks aren't doing anything, as the f file and c file are blockaded, are closed by white's own pawns. And the white queen is also placed within this pawn chain, so it cannot become active. While the opposite is the case for black. He has a great light-squared bishop on the long diagonal. He can create a queen and bishop battery by moving his queen to c6. His knight will be rerouted to a great blockading d5 square via c6 and e7, and on d5 the knight will dominate the whole board. Besides that, black has a pawn majority on the queen side. He has 3 pawns against white 2 pawns, so black will push the pawns forward and will try to create a passed pawn on the queen side. So black has an active plan, and his pieces are very active, while white simply doesn't have any active plan, and the only thing left for white is to reinforce his position, his weaknesses, trying to hold it. So Smyslov plays knight c6, the knight of course is heading to d5, and what can white do? The only move that looks active is g4, and that's exactly what Gligoric does. But this, of course, weakens this diagonal even more, and now, after moving his knight to e7, Smyslov might play queen c6, threatening checkmate on h1. For this reason, Gligoric plays king h2. Now the h1 square is defended by the rook, and also vacates the g1 square for the rook, so the rook might move to g1, and probably white might think about creating some play on the g file. Smyslov plays queen c6, creating his battery, although he isn't threatening the immediate checkmate, but this move, of course, forces the white queen to stay on f2 to control the g2 square. The rooks must also keep an eye on the h1 square, so by playing queen c6 he restricts white pieces even more. Gligoric plays knight g3, and Smyslov pushes the b pawn forward. b5. The a2 pawn is weak, so Gligoric wants to get rid of it, so he pushes it forward. a4. Smyslov defends the pawn by playing a6, and the rook on c1 isn't doing anything, the c file is completely closed, so Gligoric plays rook b1, occupying the half-open file. Smyslov does the same, rook b8, and as white doesn't have any active plan, he keeps reinforcing his position. So the c3 pawn is weak, and black is going to play knight d5, attacking this pawn, so he plays bishop d2, in advance defending his weak c3 pawn. Smyslov captures on a4, opening the b file for his rook. Of course, white cannot capture right away, but Gligoric plays rook a1, and it turns out that, of course, next move he will return he will get back the pawn. Smyslov plays bishop a8, opening the b file for his rook. Now the rook might invade b2. Gligoric captures on a4 with a tempo, attacking the queen. Queen c7, and now rook b2 is threatened. For this reason, Gligoric plays rook a2, taking under control the b2 square, and also vacating the b1 square for the possible rook a1, after which both rooks will attack the weak a6 pawn. Smyslov plays rook b6, defending the weak a6 pawn and vacating the b8 square for his second rook, in order to increase the pressure on the only open b file. Gligoric exchanges on f5, g takes f, e takes f. It might seem that white has two connected central passed pawns, but these pawns aren't dangerous at all, as they cannot move forward. As soon as the e pawn moves forward, it would be captured immediately by black. Neither can the d pawn move forward, as this square is also completely under control. So these pawns, d4 and e5 pawns, keep restricting white pieces. Bishop c1 followed. Probably Gligoric is thinking about activating his bad bishop. And finally, Smyslov centralizes his knight, knight d5. Now this knight dominates the whole board, and also with a tempo, attacking the weak c3 pawn. That's why knight e2, defending the pawn. And Smyslov pushes the a pawn forward, a5. Bishop c2 followed. With the discovered attack on the pawn, the rook is closing the queen's diagonal, so the queen isn't defending the pawn, and white is threatening to capture on a5. And Smyslov makes a brilliant move now, a very beautiful move. So he plays, as his pawn is under attack, he plays rook b3, opening the queen's diagonal. Now the pawn is defended, attacking the c3 pawn for the second time, and placing his rook right under attack. So he actually sacrifices the exchange. In case white doesn't accept the sacrifice and defends his pawn, let's say by playing bishop d2, Smyslov would simply play rook b8, increasing his pressure on the b file and threatening rook b2. For this reason, Gligoric accepts the sacrifice. He captures on b3, and now we can see the idea behind this sacrifice. After c takes b, Smyslov gets a very strong, very dangerous passed pawn, with a tempo. He also gets a chance to create connected passed pawns by pushing the a pawn forward, and it will be difficult for white to stop these pawns. Besides that, he has opened the c-file for his queen. Now the c3 pawn is under attack, it's attacked twice, and he has vacated the c4 square for his knight. Of course, the knight is greatly placed on d5, but it is closing the bishop's diagonal. So the knight would be better placed on c4. On c4, it would control the b2 square and support the advance of the b pawn to b2. And also it will, on c4, when the knight is on c4, the diagonal would open and the black queen would move to c6, again creating a dangerous queen and bishop battery. So the rook is under attack, so it moves to a4. White is up the exchange, but he doesn't have any active play. His pieces are terribly placed, while the black pieces are greatly placed. All except the dark squared bishop, which is restricted by the pawns, by the white pawns. Of course, black could have captured on c3, because it's attacked twice. But in this case, after the exchange of the knights on c3, so the black would have, in this case, exchanged his great knight for white's bad knight, passive knight, and white pieces would suddenly become active. So after bishop b2, for example, the bishop is quite active. The b3 pawn would be blockaded. After the queen retreats, white would also capture the a5 pawn, and black might activate his bishop by playing bishop f8, as on g7 it wasn't doing anything. And after rook c1, it turns out that white pieces has become more active, and although black still would have a very good compensation for the exchange, white pieces would be activated and black wouldn't dominate anymore. For this reason, Smyslov didn't capture the pawn. So the activity of the pieces and to keep his opponent passive is more important than a pawn. So his knight is great, his bishop is great, his queen and rook are quite active. The only bad piece is the bishop, so Smyslov improves this bishop too. He plays bishop f8, taking under control the important diagonal. Besides that, the bishop will move to e7, from which it will control the second important diagonal. After which black will increase his domination. So now, of course, white could have pushed the c-pawn forward, attacking the knight, kicking it out, but in this case, Smyslov still would have a very good compensation for the exchange. He might have played knight b4, for example. And on b4, the knight would close the rook's line. That means the c4 pawn would be under attack. Besides that, black would have multiple threats, such as b2, for example, attacking the bishop, and in case white captures on b2, knight d3 would fork the queen and the bishop. Besides that, black might play bishop c6, attacking the rook and kicking it out from a4, after which the a pawn would move forward and black would get very dangerous connected passed pawns. So Smyslov would definitely have a great compensation for the exchange. For this reason, after bishop f8, instead of pushing the c-pawn forward, white plays bishop b2, defending the c3 pawn. So now it's time to reroute the knight to c4 in order to attack the bishop and open the light-squared bishop's diagonal. But how to do it? Smyslov found a brilliant tactical way of doing that. He plays knight e3, right under attack of the queen, with a tempo, attacking the white rook. It turns out that in case white accepts the sacrifice and captures the knight, Smyslov prepared queen c6 with the double attack, threatening checkmate on g2 and also attacking the rook. White must defend against the checkmate, after which black would capture the rook, getting back the exchange. In this case, the position from the material point of view would be equal, and black would remain his great positional advantage, and white pieces would still remain passive, so black would simply move his queen away from a4, unblocking the a-pawn would move forward, and of course black would be much better, and white wouldn't have even material compensation for this, for black's great positional advantage. So, for this reason, after knight e3, of course, Gligoric didn't capture the knight. Instead, as his rook is under attack, he plays rook a1, increasing the pressure on the a5 pawn and threatening to capture it. But, of course, knight c4 followed. The knight not only attacks the bishop, but also defends the a5 pawn. And as the bishop is under attack, Gligoric plays knight g3, opening the queen's line and defending the bishop. Bishop e7 followed, improving the bishop and creating an unpleasant threat of bishop h4, which would, of course, make white pieces even more passive. So the bishop from h4 would attack the knight, would pin it, the queen would also be indirectly attacked. For this reason, Gligoric should have probably played queen e2, moving the queen away from the possible bishop h4, from the possible attack from by the bishop once it moves to h4, and also attacking the knight for the second time, inducing black to play bishop d5 in order to defend the knight, and in this case the bishop would stand in front of the queen in case black plays queen c6, and his battery wouldn't be as dangerous anymore because black wouldn't create any checkmating threats in this case. And only after that white could have played knight f1 with the idea of knight e3 trying to remove the blockade. But instead of this, Gligoric made a mistake. Instead of queen e2, he plays knight f1 right away. And it's understandable. When you are under constant pressure, when you don't have any active plan, sooner or later you will make a mistake. That's natural. So, knight f1 followed. Of course, Smyslov creates again his battery, queen c6. Now the queen might invade h1, but it isn't clear. The follow-up isn't clear. After possible queen h1, the king will move to g3, and how will black continue the attack? It isn't clear, and now we can see Gligoric's idea behind knight f1. He returns the exchange, he captures on c4, sacrificing the exchange in his turn, and of course he expected natural queen takes c4, after which he was going to play knight e3, attacking the queen and kicking it out from c4. The queen must retreat, after which finally he would break the blockade by playing c4, followed by d5, possible d6 or e6, opening the bishop's diagonal, and he would get an active play. But Smyslov didn't capture on c4. Instead, he checkmated the white king. And now you can pause the video and try to find a spectacular forced checkmate in 4 moves. So the first move is obvious. Queen h1 check. But what's the follow-up after king g3? Gligoric missed a great move by Smyslov. So Smyslov spotted an additional attacking resource, the h-pawn. He pushes the pawn forward and threatens checkmate in 1. h4 would be checkmate. And it turns out that there is no defense. In case white prevents h4 checkmate by playing h4 himself, black would simply capture and checkmate right away. And the only way to avoid the immediate checkmate by h4 is to move the queen away from f2 in order to vacate the f2 square for the king in case black plays h4. But in this case, the white queen would stop defending the g1 square and black would play queen g1 check. The only move would be queen g2, and after queen takes g2, again the white king would get checkmated. For this reason, after h5, Gligoric resigned. And now I recommend watching a game in which Smyslov makes a magic move to turn all his pieces into monsters. But first like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.